was thinking, well, let's go back to the image that we were left with, those of us who were here a few days ago. The Buddha has been sitting under his Bodhi tree, people tree, sort of kind of Indian fig. Fantastic spreading tree with hanging branches, and branches that hang right down and actually sometimes start to grow up again. So it's got a whole world under there. But he's been there for quite a long time. We don't really know from the records how long he's been there. And lots of things have happened while he was sitting there. But he's had this astounding experience. Now this is an ordinary man. An ordinary man who was born like you, like me. But for some reason that we don't even understand, despite all the writings and everything, he's got to this point where he's broken through some kind of barrier of the mind, of understanding, that it's almost impossible to put into words. People in the later written records of the Buddha's enlightenment experience, they have a go. They say things like, the Buddha's vision was wordless, nameless. It was a vision of unlimited light, unlimited freedom, no thought because no self. And the Buddha himself said, ignorance was destroyed and knowledge arose. Darkness was destroyed and light arose. But this is rather difficult for us, isn't it? I mean, what does that mean? What happened? So I'm trying to set out today in this talk to find out a little bit more about what actually happened. I'll start from the idea of vision, and then I'll talk about how the Buddha started to teach, and then I'll actually go through the teachings that he decided to teach when he first decided to teach. So it's interesting to think about, what did the Buddha prioritize? What was his first thought that people needed to hear or that needed to be communicated? And then to finish with, I'll talk about the significance of his teaching for the people who heard it. So back to vision again, in this dark time of the year. I love this time of year actually, because in a sense, especially when we're all together with this great light in the centre of the room. Oh, I've just noticed the Buddha's wearing a robe on the shrine, on the stage. Can you all see that? Suddenly the Buddha is actually the Buddha like he might have looked under the Bodhi tree. He probably wouldn't have had such a decent robe if you think he was there for 6 weeks. Maybe he was wearing rags when he started, so it was probably a bit tatty by the time he finished. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So back to the idea of vision. What seems to have happened is that this vision at enlightenment became something that continued to pour out of the Buddha in teachings all the rest of his life. And he walked around in India on foot until he was in his 80s, and then he died. But from the point of enlightenment on until then, it seems that he was teaching people all the time, and he taught in a multitude of ways, communicating the truth that he had perceived in so many different ways, depending on who he was talking to. And we'll be hearing more about that in Vidyadharma's talk tomorrow. But still, back to the vision. He couldn't actually teach his vision. What had to happen was this kind of coming into form, which I think is really, really interesting. And I just want to spend a minute or two relating that to our experience. You all have come here for so many different reasons, but I bet you many of you have quite a clear vision of your own. something that you value above all in your life, that may have actually come to you through a deep experience of being alive. Quite often it comes with a deep experience of death. But something that you feel happened, a realization which again, like the Buddha's initial vision, may be wordless or nameless, and yet you in your heart of hearts know that something of tremendous value is here for you. That's why you've come, actually. You may not be able even to put words to it. I'm just thinking of someone in our group. I don't know why I'm here, she said. And I said, well, I know why you're here. Sometimes what we come for is to try to locate our vision somewhere so that we have a clearer sense of the way forward. But we don't actually have a form for the vision. It's just this sense of wonder, sense of mystery, sense of the unlimitless unknown, but an inspiring unknown. Actually, sometimes it's also terrifying. But you have this sort of notion, we all do. It's the part of us that I think we refer to in the short puja that we'll be reciting later on, I hope, where we say, from his greater light, a lesser light we light within us. The lamp of Bodhi shining within our hearts. Well, now, what is Bodhi? The Bodhi tree, the lamp of Bodhi. Bodhi actually just means awake. So, enlightenment is being awake. Sometimes the Buddha is called the wake. He's a totally awake man, completely awake. And he's awake in absolute confidence, absolute mindfulness, total perfect balance of mind. So, he's never going to think, oh, I wish she hadn't said that. Why did she do that? Now I'm feeling really upset. Oh, no, it's just fantastic. It's all gone brilliantly. It's lovely. There's nothing like that in this balance of mind. It's not that kind of like sometimes I feel like a jelly on a wire, to tell you the truth. I'm sort of like a little jelly, and I'm on a tightrope, and I have to keep sort of getting bits to stop falling off. Especially as I get older. But never mind, that's beside the point. So I think all of us, in my childhood I was brought up within the Christian religion, and one of the texts that I really loved was part of St. John's Gospel. I'm not going to quote it, just one bit, where it said, "The light shone in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not." So the light was there, the darkness was there, but the darkness couldn't understand what was going on. So what we've got in this notion of enlightenment is this gradual clarification of this mysterious experience of vision. And we can now start to look at how the process of teaching began. But we're inspired, if you like, all the way through by vision. I think you need to remember that when you're doing any of your practice, actually. This, as I kept saying a few days ago, this practice is challenging. It requires courage. It requires commitment. It's for heroic spirits intended. It's not easy to do this practice. I mean, if you're here and you're just going to sit around and have a nice time with your mates, well, as my Trev Andrew said the other day, you might as well have gone to the Seychelles. Here you are. It's cold, we're in a school. Let's make it work for us, huh? So, commit in. Not to anybody here, apart from yourself. So you're, in a way, committing to yourself when you connect with whatever your vision is. I hope that makes sense for you and that you're not just sitting there listening to me. I hope you're thinking, what is my vision then? You know, if you're just thinking, oh, Vandanajyoti's got a vision, that's really not enough. It doesn't matter what my vision is. It only matters what your vision is to you. And if you're not sure, then start to work. That's what I would advise. So moving on from my vision, your vision and the Buddha's vision, we realise that the Buddha had a problem with communication, which sounds a little bit strange. He was enlightened, he should have been able to do everything straight away. But actually what happened was he thought, oh, this is so profound. This law is profound and hard to see, hard to discover. It is the most peaceful and superior goal of all, not attainable by mere thought or reflection. It's subtle and it is for the wise to experience. So that's what the Buddha thought about his vision. So he thought to himself, I'll just stay here sitting under this tree. And the myth, the story tells us that there was this kind of mythical being, this benign spirit floating around. For those of you who want to know, in the text he's called Brahma Sahampati. And he heard the Buddha's thoughts. And he was going, oh no, he might not teach. And Brahma Sahampati, so the texts tell us, he said, the world will be lost, the world will perish, since the mind of the perfectly enlightened one inclines not to teach the Dharma. So this benign spirit, Brahma Sahampati, went along to the Buddha and he sat down on one side, like you do when you meet a Buddha, and he said, open for them the doors of the deathless. Let those with ears now show their faith. So he pleaded with the Buddha and said, please start to teach. And the Buddha heard him and said, okay, I will. Didn't say it like that, I can't remember what he said, but and then he thought to himself, well, who am I going to teach? Who might understand? And we come back to one of the beautiful images that was at the end, I think, of my Trivandhu's talk, where the Buddha visualized a huge lake full of lotuses. And these lotus flowers, some of them were, I don't know if you've seen a lake of lotuses, have you? They happen in India quite often, especially in Bodh Gaya. One of our friends, Damarati, fell in, I think. Sorry, I'm probably not supposed to say that. Anyway, so that in the lotus lake that the Buddha saw in his mind's eye, some of the lotuses were coming right out of the water and fully open, big, gorgeous blooms. Others were half out of the water, others were half open, others were closed buds but out of the water. And then under the water there were also different stages of development of these lotus buds and flowers. And of course that is an image of our own state of preparedness to hear the teachings. So the idea is that we who are listening to the teachings need to find a way of being open, a way of being receptive. We need to have worked on ourselves so that we're not just caught up in a whole mesh of problems and difficulties and those things, so that we can actually hear what's to be heard. Now, the Buddha thought in his great spacious mind, who can I go to teach? He remembered his two teachers that had been so pleased with his quick progress that they actually asked him to lead their followers. And the Buddha had said, no, I'm not staying here. I still haven't attained to the level of insight that I know is possible. And in any case, those two teachers he found out in his mind's eye had actually died. Then he remembered the 5 ascetics with whom he had practiced for quite some time. And they'd done all these extreme practices like you can perhaps imagine at that time in the Buddha's life in India. Still happens actually, so wandering sadhus who do all sorts of extraordinary things like stand on one leg for 6 years, or I met one called Nada Brahmananda, who was apparently able to be buried alive and stay underground for an enormous amount of time, like a week. I don't know quite what good it did anyway, but anyway, he could do that. And anyway, the Buddha in his life had lived a life of extreme asceticism. He had done some of these esoteric practices, and he'd also reduced the amount of food that he'd taken in until the point where he was almost dead. In fact, he movingly describes this way of life. He says, "Though tireless energy was aroused in me and unremitting mindfulness established, yet my body was overwrought and uncalm because I was exhausted with painful effort. But such painful feelings as arose in me gained no power over my mind." And his body was reduced to extreme emaciation. And then we read in the text, "Now when they saw me, they said, 'The monk Gautama is dying. He is a saint, for such is the way of saints.'" So, his followers had become really impressed by this level of asceticism. And in fact, the Buddha had become famous as being one of the most extreme practitioners. But he was aware that he couldn't carry on practicing like that. And we heard in Matthew's talk, yes it was, I remember now, he was at the point of death almost, and then he suddenly remembered this experience he'd had as a child, where he'd been sitting under a rose apple tree, and he remembered that he'd been blissfully happy and concentrated, free from struggle and striving, and simply just calm and relaxed and concentrated with pleasure. And when he remembered that, he thought, I think there might be something in this for me. And he came back to that experience at the point where his body was emaciated to the point of nearly to death. And he started to eat. Now, at that point, sorry, this is a bit of a rambling story. I'm wearing my Indian frock, and I don't know if you know, but Indian storytellers always go around in circles, and then they get to the point eventually. And actually, Irish storytellers tend to do that too. So now the point is that after all this enlightenment experience, and having been persuaded to teach, he suddenly remembered those 5 practitioners, and in his enlightened mind he thought, aha, I know where they are. So he set off from under the Bodhi tree, and he walked and he walked and he walked till he found them. Where they were was the deer park at Isipatana. So now this is what happened. They were sitting there kind of not eating and doing all the things that they did, very, very skinny, wild ascetics. And they saw coming over the hill this glorious, beautiful figure. And the Buddha apparently looked fantastically beautiful after his enlightenment. No, I'm mad about that. So his mind was concentrated, but this concentration affected his whole demeanour. He's described as purified and bright and unblemished, rid of defilement, with a pliant, malleable, steady mind, attaining to imperturbability. So you can imagine this really calm figure. A bit like, if you remember, our very first talk, Privadra's talk, those of you who are here, where the Buddha had seen the fourth of the sights that inspired him to set off on his spiritual journey. He'd seen a wandering sadhu with that kind of peaceful stillness. And by the way, when we are completely still and peaceful in the shrine room, and I imagine in the yoga room as well, there's something of that quality that we can bring together. And it requires every one of us to do it. Because if we're all resting in that stillness, it's just catching, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? You felt it. And then somebody goes, and somebody shuffles. And in a way, we've all lost it. So I do encourage you, when you can, please, in the shrine room, be very, very still. Because we can then remember this sense of beauty, imperturbability, and concentration. So they saw this wonderful man walking over the hill. And then suddenly they recognized him and they said, "Oh, that's Gautama, Shakya, Gautama. It was him who became self-indulgent and gave up the struggle and reverted to luxury and ate food. We're not going to have anything to do with him." So first of all, they were resistant, you see. But as he approached, they just weren't able to stick to their plan because something in him drew them to him. And they said, "Oh, your faculties are serene, friend. The colour of your skin is clear and bright." And what they did was they prepared a seat for him. They prepared the traditional offerings that in India at that time and even unto the present day people would give to an honoured guest. And then they sat down and prepared to listen to what he had to say. So that really kind of takes me to the end of the first part of my talk. So we have now the scene is set. We've got the teacher ready to teach, fully enlightened being. We've got 5 learners ready to learn. So they had to go through a process too, didn't they? Initially they were resistant. Then they were captivated by beauty. Then they offered their traditional offerings, and then they were ready. So if you think about what we do when we do a puja, it's actually that. We bring ourselves into the presence of the Buddha, whatever that means for us, whatever our highest values are, that's what the Buddha is for you. So we bring ourselves into the presence of those values, then we notice, oh, I'm in a bit of a bad mood today. We gather ourselves, we focus ourselves, and then, if we want to, we make an offering. And actually physically offering something to the shrine is done in that spirit. So we see the shrine as an embodiment of our highest ideals. And hopefully we'll have the opportunity in the next few days to tell you something about the images on the shrine, because I think that will help. So now we're going to move on to what the Buddha decided to teach. Straight away, his first teaching was, don't call me Gautama. You can't call me by that name anymore. He was quite stern. He said, I am the Tathagata, the fully enlightened one. You can't just treat me like any ordinary man. So the Buddha himself separated himself from them and made it clear what had happened to him by just removing himself slightly from there, because they were just ready to be friendly like they would be to their peers. And then he started to teach. So I'm going to go through the 3 teachings that the Buddha offered to these people. And he starts off with a teaching which we will all recognize as being so important. He said to them, well, there's absolutely no point in you carrying on with this life of asceticism. It hasn't brought you to any kind of realization. that was quite challenging too, because they were still perhaps committed to that way of life. He said there's no point in depriving yourself of food and then probably later on seeing yourself needing to go towards sense gratification and, you know, going too far the other way. So what he was picking out there was the tendency that we all have to go for a sort of duality in the way that we see the world. We're either happy or sad. We're either despondent or we're elated. We're either suffering from arrogance or we're self-denigrating. Does that sound familiar to anyone? We're either in lazy inactivity, refusing to engage, or we're manically overworking, crazy with business and emails and everything else. So it doesn't seem that we naturally find a happy middle. And in any case, the Buddha was not advocating a happy middle. The Buddha was saying, what you need to do is to see this whole business in an entirely different way. So he called it the middle way. And for me, what the middle way actually means is a way of seeing these extremes within a larger perspective. So it's not that we shouldn't be delighted that we have pleasure and that our senses are gratified. That's perfectly fine. That's the beauty of being alive. In fact, what we really want is to be more vividly alive, so that we're bright and we're in contact with our experience in a way which is vivid and fulfilling. So pleasure in life is very, very much part of life. So to see the grass as green, or the pea guacamole for that matter, to enjoy the taste of the spicy potatoes with the cool of the green guacamole. This is important, just to savour these beautiful things. Not only food, of course, but, you know, this beautiful image of Manjushri here with his flaming sword of cutting through ignorance. The beauty of the eyes of these images on the shrine. The beauty of the natural world. Troy the pony and his apple-eating habit. And anything else. The waving of the winter trees. And I don't know if you noticed the chorus of rooks this morning when we were just finishing our meditation. It was although they'd just been waiting till we were really quiet and then they started up. I'm sure they thought they were opera singers, but actually they're making a terrible noise. But it was lovely to hear them. So just to sort of savour those things, whether they're from your sight or your hearing, your smell, your taste, your physical sensations. But what we tend to do, of course, with those things, whether they're positive sensations or painful ones, is that we get totally stuck into them. So the Buddha's saying, yes, enjoy your life. Enjoy your sensations. But then he says, but the pleasant feeling that arose in this way did not invade my mind or remain. The pleasant feeling that arose in this way did not invade my mind or remain. Now, what does this mean for us? You just imagine yourself in meditation, and suddenly you just feel a sense of euphoria and peace. And you think, oh, that's a really lovely sense of euphoria and peace. Oh, that's great. Because as soon as you go for it like that, you're trying to sort of keep it and hold it, and then it isn't it anymore. So what you've got to do is something else, just sort of watch the passing of these things. And in our practices, particularly in the way that we've been teaching it and in just 2 or 3 days ago, what we're saying is stay with the feeling, watch the feeling tone, watch the feeling sensation, and guess what? Like everything else, it will change. So it's sort of staying in touch with that is the middle way, rather than thinking, this is the most gorgeous thing that's ever happened to me in my life, I'm really, really loving it, and or this is so awful, I can't stand it, getting into sort of reaction. So in other words, making a huge story out of the thing, rather than simply noticing the experience that you're having. So that's one aspect of the middle way. There are other things we could say about it, but for today that's enough. And I would like to move on to a second really, really important teaching that ties into the Four Noble Truths. Coming from the middle way, the Buddha gives his 5 followers some help in how to develop this approach to things. He says what you need to do is to live an ethical life, an ethical, refining path. And he described for them a path which he called the Noble Eightfold Path. And he described the path as being inspired by true vision, insight, knowledge and understanding. So the Noble Eightfold Path is the 4th of the 4 Noble Truths that I'm going to talk about just now. I'd like to describe the 4th Noble Truth first. I don't think that's perverse. No, it's all right. Because actually what we need to do with all of this business is to have real faith that there is the possibility of change and growth for us. There's no point at all in thinking that we're going to get stuck in some kind of gloomy, depressing place. What we need, in fact, is to be in touch with that bright vitality in life, no matter what's happening. And that vitality comes from connecting with your actual experience. So, this ethical, refining path, the Noble Eightfold Path, is a kind of description of how we should live in the world. And we need to understand that how we live in the world depends on a great law that the Buddha understood at his, after his enlightenment. And that law is that everything arises on the basis of conditions. And there's nothing in the universe that's not covered by this law. Everything arises on the basis of conditions which precede it. And when those conditions change, the thing changes itself. Now, those are just words. What on earth does that mean? Well, in the next 10 minutes or so, I hope that we'll be able to understand it. Let me start with myself. Here I am, I'm standing in front of you. The reason I'm standing here, there's not one reason. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of conditions that have made me stand here in front of you. The first probably is that my father met my mother in 1947 in Dublin. They got married and had me. But also, I walked into the London Buddhist Centre in 1988 in order to learn to meditate. Why did I accept it? Why didn't I just walk into the London Buddhist Centre and walk away again? Why did I like it? Well, I think what I saw there, I can remember it to this day actually. I was met by a kind of loud, large Scottish person who said, "Oh yes, you can meditate." He's called Dan Avira. I said, yeah, you can meditate. Yeah, it's all right. I said, I don't think I can, I don't think I'm the sort of person who can meditate. I said, everybody can meditate, it'll be fine. I'm sorry, it's a terrible Scottish accent. I beg your pardon, dear. But I just remember being struck by his normalness. And he was, in fact, the person who taught the Wednesday class at the time. And he taught me to meditate. And every time I see him, I thank him. I just go up to him and say, "Thank you, Dan Vera." He's usually forgotten. He doesn't remember. Every time, I must have thanked him about 30 times. And he still doesn't sort of say, "Oh, yes, I remember." He doesn't remember. But it doesn't matter, because I actually feel tremendous gratitude to him. And of course, he wouldn't have been able to teach me to meditate if it hadn't been for the London Buddhist Centre. And the London Buddhist Centre in itself is the most extraordinary collection of, conditions coming together to cause fantastic results. If Bhante Sangharakshita hadn't come back from India and started to get all these followers around him, and teach them, then they would never have had the courage to move into that burnt out fire station and start to renovate it. I mean, you have no idea, if you haven't seen them, how awful the pictures of that place were. And there was only one person who knew how to build anything. The rest of them were just keen volunteers like you and me. So what an extraordinary coming together of conditions. It's quite difficult to understand, isn't it, that what we do happens on the basis of all sorts of conditions in the universe. And everything that we do has an effect in all sorts of unknown ways. I find that kind of quite an astounding realization sometimes, because we can very easily experience ourselves as quite isolated in the world. Like, you know, I got born and here I am, I stand in my space wearing my Indian frock because this is a celebratory evening. And like, whatever I do has no effect on you. Or, if you were just a little bit open, maybe something that I'm saying would have a huge effect on you. I don't know. That's up to you. I'm trying my best, but you have to be receptive to me. You know, I'm being as active as I can. But if you're not, you know, if you're just sitting there falling asleep, what am I, you know, what can I do? You know, I could be more interesting maybe, I could be more vibrant, I could be more vital. But actually, what we're talking about here is your action of receptivity, like the 5 ascetics to the Buddha. Your action of receptivity is what will make the difference here. You know, I can't really do much more than this. This is my best. So, we've got a big problem coming up now. We've had the 4th Noble Truth, which is the way to do it. We've got to live an ethical life. We've got to notice that we have an effect on the people around us. We can't just live in a bubble. We have to notice that how we speak to people has an effect. We have to notice what actions we do in the world have an effect. We have to notice how we earn our living has an effect. And this should be inspired by our vision of what's really important. In order for us to understand that, we really have to meditate. Our minds are like kind of cardboard boxes quite often. You know, give them a kick and they cave in. It's like, you know, we need to be robust. Our minds need to be strong. And they need to be pliable. Do you remember that description of the Buddha's mind? Pliable. I can't find it now. Never mind. You know what I mean. Malleable, steady, rid of defilement. If we're going to be able to do that to our minds, we really have to meditate. It's the only way. By meditate, I mean find out what's going on. I don't mean sit there in bliss. That would be jolly nice. But it won't happen if you try to ignore the fact of the 1st Noble Truth. At last she gets to the point. The 1st Noble Truth. The 1st Noble Truth that the Buddha started to teach to those 5 ascetics is the truth of suffering. Now, he wasn't saying life is suffering, it's all doom and gloom. From his enlightened perspective, he looked at the condition of human beings and other beings, including the oxen in his father's fields, and he saw suffering. It wasn't only just physical pain. He saw people aging. He saw people being ill. He saw death. He said, there is suffering, birth, aging, illness, death, union with what is displeasing, separation from what is pleasing. So in other words, getting what you don't like and not getting what you do like. Not getting what you want. And then he says, all phenomena affected by clinging are suffering. Now, clinging here means attachment. So I'm going to say that again because I think it's really hard to understand. All phenomena affected by attachment are suffering. Now the word that's used here, suffering, is kind of a bit of a hold-all of a word, and I think it's quite helpful to use the Sanskrit Pali word, which is dukkha. And dukkha is translated sometimes as an ill-fitting wheel. So basically what the Buddha is saying is that life is unsatisfactory at times. We feel discomfort. We feel emotional and psychological pain, disappointment, unease, frustration, emptiness, pointlessness, sense of something missing, not just the nature of our physical condition, which is aging, sickness, death, and birth, of course. That involves a fair bit of pain too, quite often, as some of us know too well. So it's not necessarily a strong emotion, this dukkha. It could be just little twinges of lack that I'm sure we all know very, very well. Everything's fine, we're happily engaged in something, and then suddenly there's just a little shudder of dissatisfaction. And even pleasurable things cause us pain. We fear that we'll lose the things we love, even when we have them in our hands. And notice that the Buddha says there is suffering. It's not you will suffer. You will. The Buddha says there is suffering. It's not my suffering or your suffering. It's suffering. Suffering is there. Suffering exists. It's not because I've been sinful and done something wrong that I'm suffering. It's the nature of having a self, having a personality, having a fixed sense of my own identity. And because of that, I'm going to bump up against your fixed sense of your identity. And yours, and yours, and yours. So what I want is not going to be what you want. And what you want might not be what I want, some of the time. And if we don't remember that other teaching of just noticing the feeling and staying with that and letting it fade, then we just, well, we have wars, we have bombs, we have destruction, we have the Middle East, we have Rwanda, we have the Holocaust, we have all of that. But the fact is, we don't have to be there. The Buddha is very, very clear that this is what the situation is if we do not understand the nature of reality. Because the second noble truth offers us a road towards the solution to this suffering. The second noble truth is that suffering arises on the basis of craving. Craving is the condition for suffering arises. Remember I said conditions are there. Everything that arises on the basis of conditions. When those conditions change, what arises changes. So what the Buddha is telling us is, because we crave things, we suffer. And I would like you just to spend a little minute thinking about this. I'd like you to think about some suffering or dissatisfaction in your life. It may be that your knees are feeling a bit rough now, because you've been sitting there for quite a long time. Is it true that there's some sort of desire behind that suffering? It's a rhetorical question. Unfortunately, we haven't time to answer it. But just have a think for a minute of something in your life that causes you suffering. Do you agree with the Buddha that where the suffering is, there's some sort of attachment, some sort of craving, some sort of desire? And of course the Buddha says, you shouldn't believe what I say, you should test it in your own experience. But he also says you need also to believe the teaching of the wise. So it's all very well testing your own experience, but sometimes you jolly well need some help. I certainly did. I knew I was kind of interested in spiritual things years and years before 1988, where I got into the Buddhist Centre. I mean, it wasn't until I got there that I began to realise why I felt that my life was a totally empty, if successful life. You know, there I was, living in my 4-bedroom house in South London with my paramarital partner. We didn't marry in those days. We were too cool. We just lived together for 16 years. And then he walked off with somebody else. What? I hope you're watching. Sorry, that's a bit flippant. It was a long time ago, you know, and I'm much better off now than I ever imagined I could be. I remember we went on holiday one year. We were in France. We'd had a wonderful time. Totally lovely. And we were in this kind of quite nice hotel on the way home, and I started to cry. I cried and I cried and I cried and I cried. This was at the end of the holiday. And he said, oh, come on, it's not so bad. You know, we've had a nice time. We have to go home sometime. I'm not crying about going home. I was just suddenly gutted at the sense of lack in my life. And everything I could have possibly imagined I needed, I had. And yet there was this gap. I was not living my ideals. I was not in tune with my vision. I was far from it, actually. So it was rather good when we split up. Anyway, that's another story. I would like to move on to the third noble truth, which, of course, is fantastically interesting and complex. I kind of hardly have the nerve to try and tell you what it means. I'll just tell you what it is. The third noble truth here says that there is a way out of suffering. And the Buddha says, and you've got to believe it. You've got to believe it. There's no point in just knowing that there's a way out. You've got to believe that there's a way out. You've got to understand. You've got to stand under the fact that if you notice craving leads to suffering, then you can do something about the craving. And then you've done something about the suffering. Do you see how it goes? It's a chain reaction. There's a nice old song about that. So, look, just get the message. This is really the most important point. It's not that Buddhism says it's all suffering. What Buddhism says is notice that when you crave and get attached to things, you're likely to suffer. If you stop that craving and attachment, then you won't suffer so much. And one of the ways, you know, we've already pointed this out, one of the ways you can help yourself is by living an ethical life, noticing how you get on with other people, trying to stop, you know, being a cardboard box, bumping into the other cardboard box, trying to develop your mind through meditation, following the Eightfold Path. Maybe we'll say more about that in the groups or something. I don't want to do so now. But this is a really, really important message. So when people say to you, oh, you went on a Buddhist retreat, that must have been terribly sad. You know, because it's all about suffering, isn't it, Buddhism? You know, many people say that to me, very, very intelligent friends of mine, and they still cannot believe that, you know, I've got a bit more sense. Why would I commit myself to a way of life that says it's going to be terrible? I'm not that sort of a person. So, I'd like us just to end this talk to join in with what happened after the Buddha had given this teaching of the Four Noble Truths. So this is really, really important because if you remember what I was saying at the beginning when we were talking about the Buddha's vision, it was kind of wordless. It couldn't take form. He had to struggle to be persuaded to try to articulate his depth of understanding in a way that people could take on. And how do you know that somebody's understood? Well, you see changes in their lives, don't you? It's all very saying, yes, 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 I know what you mean. So we have 3 levels of wisdom in Buddhism. There's studying, which means hearing, like you're doing now. Practicing, which means sitting here together in this community. Learning to meditate, living with each other, putting up with the frustrations and the, problems in the building and everything else. Enjoying yourselves. But it also means studying, practicing, and realizing. So this 3rd level of wisdom is to do with when your whole being is totally transformed. Totally transformed. So you started off in one state and you've ended up in another. So what happened is this. After the 5 ascetics had heard this teaching, which is sometimes called the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, suddenly one of them said, "The spotless, immaculate vision of the Dharma has arisen in me." And he was just like, "Oh." He said, "All that is subject to arising is subject to cessation. All that is subject to arising is subject to cessation." So this guy's name was Kondanya. And he suddenly understands. I mean, what does that phrase mean? It's the same as this being, that becomes, the ceasing of this, that ceases. This, all things arise on the basis of conditions, and when those conditions change, this thing changes. That's what Kondanya suddenly understood. And when he understood it, this is what happens, and this you'll be pleased to hear is the end of my talk. Now, while this discourse was being delivered, the spotless, immaculate vision of the Dharma arose in the Venerable Kondanya thus: "All that is subject to arising is subject to cessation." And when the wheel of the law had been set rolling by the Blessed One, the earth deities cried out, "At Benares, in the deer park at Isipatana, a perfect one, accomplished and fully enlightened, has set rolling the matchless wheel of the law, which cannot be stopped by monk or Brahmin or deity or Mara or divinity or anyone in the world." And hearing the earth deities cry, the deities of the 4 kings heaven and the 33 deities of Tavitsama and the contented deities of Tushita and the delighted deities of Nimanarati and the deities of Brahma's retinue cried out, "At Benares, in the deer park at Isipatana, a perfect one, accomplished and fully enlightened, has set rolling the matchless wheel of the law, which cannot be stopped by monk or Brahmin or deity or Mara or divinity or anyone in the world." So at that moment, at that minute, at that instant, the news travelled right up to the Brahma world. And this 10,000-fold world element shook and quaked and trembled, while a great, measureless light, surpassing the splendour of the gods, appeared in the world. And then the Blessed One exclaimed, "Kondanya knows! Kondanya knows!" Then Kondanya, who had seen and reached and found and penetrated the law, whose uncertainties were left behind, whose doubts had vanished, who had gained perfect confidence and become independent of others in the teacher's dispensation, said to the Blessed One, "Lord, I wish to go forth under the Blessed One and to receive the full admission." "Come, Bhikkhu," said Blessed One. "The law is well proclaimed. Live the holy life for the complete ending of suffering, full of grace